Okay, we're officially ready to get going. All right. Okay. Thanks everyone for staying with us through what I feel were two great days. I think the level of fatigue everyone is probably feeling is probably commensurate with the level of effort required to build an agenda around economic resilience, which is the topic of this final session. Where I kind of want to get to by the end of the session is to have maybe answers or thoughts from as many people in the room as possible on the question of where the key gaps in knowledge, advice, and guidance around bringing economic resilience into national policy agendas. To get us there, I'm going to ask a few hopefully thought-provoking questions to our panel. I'm going to start with Rathin. He's senior visiting fellow here at ODI. He's also mentioned that he lectures for money. Rathin, reflecting on the past 2 days, as well as your own experience, what are the most significant opportunities and impediments to bringing economic resilience into national policy agendas? We've heard a lot about political will and like how important it is, but I think it often gets treated as exogenous, and I don't think that's the case.
Okay, thanks. And thank you for forcing me to attend each and every session so I can speak at the end. So let me start with the first word that defined or framed this conference, polycrisis. I think talking to policymakers, at least across the large emerging economies, which is the space I now inhabit, I think there's a sense of not knowing where we are. There's a lot of talk of where we possibly are. So here's my take for what it's worth running from this conference and where we are. I think the problem is that we are not coming from nowhere. History is important. And there was an extant set of questions that Adam Tooze, who spoke at the last conference, used to define what he described as a polycrisis. Now we have a geopolitical overlay over that. And the name of that overlay is Mr. Donald Trump. It's as simple as that, actually. That is the one major fact. I don't know why we pussyfoot around this, that has changed in the world I used to inhabit. The election of Trump Mark II has caused a number of derivative crises in the economic sphere that has made it immediately urgent for finance ministries to deal with, large and small. Even though I'm in opposition, I was actually asked for help to develop a plan to deal with Trump's tariffs. Because India is very badly affected by them. And I, in fact, wanted to thank Minister Oliveira because we just copybooked from the Brazilians. They've done a great job. But that would not have happened without Trump. I would not be worrying about the disappearance of my major service industry exports without Trump. So even if these things are not macroeconomically manageable, we cannot, and that's my second point, address them technocratically. You see, the entire 30 years since I finished my PhD have been spent on the blissful assumption that good technocratics is both necessary and sufficient to solve problems that political economy poses. That was the promise of globalization. That was the promise of neoliberal thinking. And we went along with it. You should have seen my IMF colleagues and their confidence in structural adjustment. I mean, the sheer confidence that they were speaking the word of God and that there could be no other way to do things other than structurally adjusted. Fast forward to today, and the latest fund, which I absolutely love, debt sustainability analysis, does something I've been asking for all my life. It took Trump to bring it. I'm deeply grateful to him. It distinguishes between domestic and external debt. It talks about a world with capital controls. And it brings in other parameters into debt sustainability, such as what the debt is actually spent on. So that cookie cutter kind of approach that neoliberal politics did was not there. And this is a response to politics, which I think it's fantastic the fund has done this, because the fund is responding agilely to an extreme political situation. Now, so that is one. And the second outcome of the policy crisis is going to be the geopolitical change is going to be, I think, the abandonment for, I think, probably the rest of my life. I mean, if I live reasonably long, the assumption of between country convergence. I think that's over. Because the kinds of things that the trends we saw, which were promising convergence, especially for, let's say, emerging G20 economies, no longer hold. And if they don't hold for the G20 economies, they certainly don't hold for anybody else. It is not even sufficient now to be a satellite of the US to be able to converge or even hold your own. And that means that the first polycrisis, the trend that they had, which was growing inequality across the world, and I don't like the word development, I never used it, the crisis of intergenerational prosperity, which is very frightening, and all these have public finance implications, which I'll come to in 10 seconds, is becoming worse. What is that? It means that basically young people for the first time in the last 150 years, young people today, unless Papa has some legacy to give you, whether you live in England or you live in Japan or in India or in Botswana, you are going to be poorer than your parents. And this is the first time the world is seeing this. I'm part of a global prosperity project where this is being shown empirically across the globe. It's a terrible thing because it also means, therefore, since most of the younger people in the world live in countries like mine, you're going to get deepening intra-country inequality. These are all very relevant when we frame public finance frameworks, because straightforwardly, the first thing this means is that the model where, and all this talk we've been doing about universal basic incomes and social protections, those are not going to be enough anymore, even if they were earlier in some imaginary world, to address the question of prosperity. Unemployment benefit is not going to solve for the lack of prosperity in Britain. Social protection is not going to solve for the lack of prosperity in India. And Bolsa Familia is not going to solve for inadequate educational outcomes in Brazil anymore. So immediately, what does that mean? That means that finance ministries will have to start looking at what I call, in work I've done, compensatory payments to various groups in society at scale. We are already doing it in India. India is supposed to be a big country. Read the bump from government of India. Very famous, very big, growing. But we subsidize 800 million people. 800 million people get food subsidies in India out of a total population of 1.4 billion. It's a bizarre country with a GDP, I don't know where it is now, third largest, fourth largest, something, right? A per capita income, quite respectable, $3,200, subsidizing 800 million people. And the reason India has eliminated extreme poverty is because you're subsidizing 800 million people, not because they're earning enough not to be poor. So that leads to a very different sort of paradigm task in front of the finance ministries. Second point, and I'll do 2 points quickly and end with predictions, is the two next points are very fast. This is, I think, the major public finance implication, that the fall in prosperity that has come now and the unlikelihood of convergence will mean that the way we think about both public spending and where our taxation is going to come from is going to change or have to change radically. Ideas of fiscal prudence will take a back seat unless we're able to deal with these new demands coming forward. And this really worries me, and I think it should worry every finance ministry leader. The two other points are, you've got to take a bet. You have to take a bet on whether Trump is going to stay or not. Trump or his successor. I mean, this current state of affairs, or if you like, if Farage is going to be the next leader of Britain, if the lady in France whose name I can never remember is going to come to power or not. In other words, you're going to have to take a bet on what the political complexion of the world is going to be, because that has derivative finance ministry implications for you. In the case of the US, there's an excellent paper, again by Geeta Gopinath, who has become very productive after leaving the IMF, which shows that the impact of tariffs has been that US revenue, we were talking about this, Frederick, and only revenue has gone up. Everything else is more expensive. So macroeconomic management then becomes more a question than the original DRM question that economic and finance ministries will have to tackle. You also need to take a bet on China. Is China going to genuinely supplant the US as the world's knowledge leader? What role will it play in international cooperation? And the third and final point, and then I'll make 4 predictions and stop, is performative public finance is over. By which I mean everything that's gone on in the G20 since at least the Chinese presidency, or the increasing lack of anything useful anyone has to say at fund bank meetings. Because there is a polycrisis, finance ministry is the center of it, and we cannot anymore have like good food is good for you kind of statements happening at these international gatherings. So it's very comfortable to do for 25 years. Everyone had a good time, but that time is over now. They'll have to deal with hard questions and harder trade-offs. So I have 4 final predictions, I think, which will context fiscal policy making in the future, looking outside fiscal policy, but which everyone in finance ministries will have to keep an eye on, and I'll stop with them. One is there's going to be a reserve currency question, and we should all be alert to it very early. The reserve currency question is now not a closed question. It is becoming a more open question. And there are various things happening to sort of circumvent the reserve currency problem. I've been involved with something with Sri Lanka, which ODI is aware about. Capital controls are going to be there for the foreseeable future, and they're going to increase in nature and magnitude and volume. And we will have to run a finance ministry, understanding that we are going to have to deal with capital controls and their consequences in a variety of areas, which I don't have time to go into. The third is that discretionary global consumption is going to fall, and this is going to have an impact on tax. If things are going to become more expensive in Europe and in the US, then all the nice things they buy and all the tourist spots they come to in the third world, not just aid, even their actual discretionary consumption, that's going to become more expensive. They're going to demand less, right? And if they're going to demand less, then that means that has taxation implications and revenue implications, I think, for the rest of the world. Penultimately, large economies, all the large ones, everyone in G20 who is large they're going to start looking inward more and more, because I can't think of a single large economy from South Africa to India to Brazil to Turkey that does not have an ongoing domestic crisis at home, which will have to pay greater and greater attention to. So time and space that they're going to afford to look outside, which was the expectation that would happen, that in fact informed the G20, is going to fall. And the last point I have is that this is not about a cycle. This is not a cycle. This is a trend shift. This is not about cycles of prosperity going down, up and down, or ideological cycles. So therefore, I think the analytical equipment that ministries of finance will have to use when we advise the prime minister on what to do about economic matters arising is going to be much more on trend and less on cycle. Thank you.
Thanks, Ratan. I think that should give plenty of people food for thought on what some of the knowledge gaps might be. But I'm going to switch immediately to Joseph, Head of Tax Policy at the National Treasury of Kenya. Joseph, yesterday, Andy was talking about, if you're trying to build economic resilience, don't start from a tight spot. Unfortunately, Kenya is in a very tight spot. I think you've told me 40% of revenues go on interest payments. Deficit is at 6% of GDP, with a lot of recurrent spending commitments that are difficult to unwind. Like Antoinette was mentioning yesterday, fiscal consolidation is unfortunately on the cards for Kenya, but obviously not easy. And then kind of sustaining your growth rate is also important and obviously very politically important. You do have lots of reforms ongoing. If you had to pick three of the reforms that are ongoing, which do you think should be prioritized as the most promising? Not just from a technical standpoint, but also in terms of the reforms that are likely to, resonate with politicians and citizens, and those that the government has the capability to deliver on.
Address some of those financing gaps through revenue. So you have to be more innovative. How do you ensure you're able to get taxation? No, not get taxation, to get more revenue without increasing taxes. And that's be a very big issue, because yesterday when it was being discussed, Kenya is one of the countries which have threatening fiscal sustainability because of the debt, of the debt services, which is taking toll. And though currently is manageable, but it is telling us you have no room of borrowing more. You have to work within the resources which you have, so that you're able to address the issues. And as we have said, part of our debt is clearly coming because of pressure on spending, where there is some collective bargaining which have been undertaken, but they want to be financed, because we have agreed that you have to address collective bargaining agreement which was signed some time back, and they were not being implemented. Then there was a change in the funding model of the university, which called for additional financing, which has to be done. Despite that, now there are also challenges on international stock, which normally come to affect what you have planned. Some of them is global, like COVID-19. There was international fuel prices, which increases, but also climate-related finance, which has been mentioned. And as we try to address some of these reform, maybe enhancing our revenue collection without increasing taxes, that is addressing the issue of tax expenditure, which was one of the issues. We are also facing some challenges. the beneficiary of those tax expenditure also resist because they are benefiting it. They were being yesterday say that they do not benefit the entire, but certain sector are also benefiting. And as we try also to reform those tax expenditure, we also get others which are also being introduced because of this climate, which we have discussed, climate finance. How do you support climate finance? You want to give incentives so that we have green bond be issued. You also want to support related expenditure or investment in green finance. So you have dilemma as you try to address to align with the international addressing of climate finance and what you have agreed, then there's pressure of addressing the industry. So it's a big complex area that how do you balance the expenditure which is eroding your tax base, at the same time addressing commitment internationally, addressing some areas which you think they are able to promote investment so that we are able to get finance. It's a complex which have been tried to how do you do with it. The area which has mentioned that how do we address reforms which can do, the issue is that having political will to address some of those expenditures pressures. That let's agree that you work within your fiscal deficit. That means we have a target to reach 3% at the EAC level, but we are not able to reach there because of those pressure which has come. But you request maybe the minister can get commitment to continue reducing, we call fiscal consolidation, through enhancing compliance in taxation. That means that we believe it's not 100% of those who are supposed to pay are paying the taxes. Our compliance level is around 60%, but if we can enhance to 80 through leveraging on technology and also more compliance, maybe you're able to narrow the gap, because raising taxes to finance that deficit is not goes on. You try, you get a lot of resistance from everybody, including the youth, which are now saying, we have a taxes, please don't come to that level. The other reform which we can say is that reforming on how do we do things in terms of expenditure management, that is prudent financial management. We have introduced what we call e-government procurement, where you're able to manage procurement, because in procurement, we believe there may be some wastage which have been happening there, and we're able to, if we're able to successfully implement that e-procurement, which is now ongoing, we are likely to reduce some of those expenses which have been going. And also last night on the non-core expenditures, seminars and workshop and conference, reduce that expenditures so that we are able to narrow the fiscal deficit, not through increased tax revenue, but increasing reducing tax expenditure on non-core activities, at the same time enhancing revenue collection. We are also going away, and you remember last year, there was a exchange rate crisis. That means there was pressure because of the debt we have borrowed externally. And there was that kind of information leaked to the public that Kenya is likely to default. And the exchange rate went up, though it was maybe, I don't know who provided the information. And there was that kind of a fear and people are panic buying the dollars and hiding, waiting for the government to. But we are able to manage, and now it is coming down because of that. So what message was that try to ensure you balance between what you are buying internally and externally, though initially it was a good initiative. Try to remove the crowding out of the private sector and borrow from outside. But it has told us that the information we are receiving is that as you do that one, do proper mix because of those volatility of the exchange, which can also come and hit you hard. Because by that time, every percentage of increase in exchange rate, we are getting around that $1 billion increase in our public debt. Meaning that if they are continue to reach 200, our debt could have burst and could not have been able to sustain it. Maybe it could. But that the message was that please, as you do balancing, make sure you don't borrow external too much and don't borrow the domestic too much. Try to balance how you're going to do it. Otherwise, it's a big issue, and we manage that time, and we hope maybe the year 2024 will not be repeated where you have finance being rejected, executives being misbehaving, and we are now currently trying to manage the fiscal consolidation through enhancing revenue collection, but not raising the taxes. And we are also thinking of borrowing concessionally outside maybe the changing from IMF and World Bank
Joseph.
and
Thanks.
World Bank, we are still
I-
going to borrow from.
I'm just going to stop you there because in the interest of time, and those are points very well made. Interesting to hear you mention tax expenditures, which I expect my colleague Hazel Granger and Peter Hurst will be working with you on through the tax dev program. But also interesting to hear you talk about the youth connecting to Ratten's previous point as well. Surely something that folks in the audience might be able to pick up on when we move to Q&A in a moment. Kay, over the last 2 days, we've heard a lot about trade-offs. You know, trade-offs between setting aside funds for short-term responses versus investing them in long-term growth, but also trade-offs between different types of short-term responses, disaster risk financing, whether to earmark it to certain things or not, like through the social protection system. And we've also mentioned capabilities quite a lot. It would be nice if we could make policy decisions based simply on economic returns, but really these policies are only as good as government's ability to implement them. And this has been a point of emphasis for your organization, the Collaborative African Budget Reform Initiative, CABRE, which you lead. You and I also spent a week in DC at the World Bank Conference on Reimagining Public Finance last week, dedicated to this topic of taking an outcome-led approach to reform that focuses on identifying and addressing bottlenecks or capability gaps to specific reforms. So my question to you is, how do you think this outcome or problem-driven approach is something that can help governments to engage with these decisions around trade-offs? Because it's not just about which is the best policy, it's which is the best policy that you can actually implement.
Thank you for that question. I think one of the exciting things about being here is having heard how different countries and different experiences are bringing their technical tools and their capabilities to bear in terms of very, very specific and very technical, complex areas. I think we started off with Andy telling us that there's nothing that isn't the business of a finance ministry. Later on in that session, I think it was that same session, we also were told that perhaps some of this work isn't for the finance ministry, who should stick to the technical work, and then maybe the broader issues are not for the finance minister. And I think in the session that we just had, we're probably convinced with bias in the room, of course, because we represent finance ministries, many of us, or have come from that, that the finance ministries are central. So the key thing is we have a lot to deal with. And then we were also told to imagine shocks and have to deal with all the scenarios on that. And I think Joseph has pointed out some of those technical issues. But the key thing that we believe in is the capacitation of public finance officials within the Ministry of Finance, but that essentially we're dealing with country problems and country hard trade-offs, and that the decisions in implementation happen at various levels of government. And we spoke about cities earlier today and so on, and also within very specific technical divisions. So essentially, if we want to address this, we have to address the so-called people problem, which means we should focus on an outcome-led, emphasis on led approach in speaking and engaging with various stakeholders. And I think we've touched tangentially on that. Antoinette also spoke about civil society and engaging Parliament briefly in passing, but there are really many, many stakeholders that have insights into solving the problem. And whatever the problem of the day is, it is always worthwhile to sit and unpack that with the professionals that are dealing with that at various different levels, whether that's sort of with a multinational lens, with a macroeconomic lens within the Department of Finance, whether it's the environmental ministry, whether it's a trade issue. Once these issues are unpacked and understood within the local context, that is when the universe of possibilities for that particular country and context will come to light. And essentially, that is when the problem solving and the capacitation helps the most. The focus has to be on function and not form. So yes, we have all of these tools. In fact, we should be careful not to be overwhelmed by the number of the tools we have and how technically sophisticated they actually can be. The key thing is which ones we use and how we use them. And as decisions are being made, how do you iteratively use the evidence that you have at hand? And that is not only generated by data models or AI models, but also qualitative information from communities and so on. And I think the experience from Manja, when she shared that about discussions with communities around what they really want and how to go towards that is very important. Essentially, only by using this kind of approach, which is focused on what it is that you have to deliver and then exactly how you're going to work together to do that, is it possible to unpack various kinds of problems and how they manifest, whether that's in terms of underspending or in terms of financing gaps, and how one prioritizes and takes the situation forward in the best possible way, given the current constraints. That's the reality. And essentially, you have to have a people approach. It's all about how we use our tools and techniques and how we're going to be resilient in the future.
And just briefly, reflecting, back to your time in National Treasury in South Africa, how would this kind of more outcome-led, problem-driven approach to prioritizing areas of reform, how would that go down in a finance ministry that might be a little bit more stuffy, for example?
A lot more difficultly, but that would make it even more important that work gets done, because at the end of the day, treasuries and departments are filled with people that are professionally very qualified. In some cases not, but generally you do have a good cadre of people that are on top of the processes that they normally execute and the kinds of evidence they normally bring to bear, and they're comfortable to make those decisions. However, I think as we've already discussed, well, in the whole conference, but also just from the previous two inputs as well, the context has changed radically, and it's really, really important to understand even within a treasury, let alone across line ministries and in different spheres of government, what is actually the understanding of the problem, where exactly are the blockages, and how to go about unblocking them, basically.
Thanks, Kate. Michael, turning to you, you're something of a guru of these international agendas and processes and platforms, much like the things that Ivan was speaking about in the previous session. We've heard from Antoinette yesterday, kind of, the IMF can and other IFIs can kind of help policymakers like Joseph, who are, in a tough spot, like with managing tough political economies. What do you think these international actors, not specifically the IMF, but in general, need to do differently to support these economic resilience agendas where they're emerging? What can they do that they're not doing at the moment?
Well, they can provide more money. I'll come back to that one because that's there is something significant to say just about the quantum of money that goes to resilience and adaptation. But specifically for the IMF and the World Bank, I want to pick up the point I made earlier in the early discussion about the debt sustainability analysis. I don't think finance ministers are absolutely central because they control the money. That doesn't mean that they know everything. And they often think they do. You know, finance ministers tend to be very arrogant about I worked in the British Treasury, so I know of whereof I speak, that they know, and on climate change, which is what I'm mainly dealing with, so resilience in terms of climate change, I don't think finance ministers have properly understood what is happening. I don't think they've understood, for example, that the inflation that we're experiencing all around the world now is now climate related. The supply shocks that we're beginning to see now in almost every sector, there is some disaster somewhere in the world that is affecting a major commodity, and that can be manufactured commodities, food commodities, and so on. And I don't think they've understood that. So I think I don't think they've understood the extent to which climate risks will be multiplying and therefore affecting growth rates. And if you look at the IMF World Bank debt sustainability analysis, it doesn't properly account for the economic benefits of resilient spending. So it's now got more in it on the risk side. And of course, that then becomes very difficult because it's basically saying countries are more risky than they were, so their positions get worse, but hasn't acknowledged that if you mitigate those risks, if you take the resilience measures, your growth rates will be better. And I don't think that fundamental relationship between growth rates and long-term growth prospects and resilience in a climate changing world has been properly understood, and it's not then reflected in the DSAs. And if the DSAs aren't right, then the IMF's analysis of each economy isn't right. Countries' debt sustainability is not right, and the amount of money that you would get in a debt restructuring isn't right. It's really fundamental, this. And the IMF, World Bank are very influential in those processes. So I do think we need to understand these things better. In defense of those institutions, they are trying. They are now working on it. Their modeling is still a bit weak, but that's true of all models, and that we've got better techniques that we can use. So I do think there's a kind of intellectual, analytical case. There's more that can be done to really understand what this climate crisis is about. And I don't think we've fully understood that. The point that I'd make about the money is we have constrained money. There's always constrained money, and so there really are questions of where it should be spent. On mitigation, which is a huge priority, the technologies are now such that if the cost of capital more reflected the risk, we'd need to subsidize much less on the mitigation side. The cost of capital, even in a very successful economy like India, is ridiculous compared to the cost of capital in developed countries. The credit ratings are ridiculous, and that's not based on kind of, you know, there's just a kind of racist misunderstanding. They're not looking at the data. They're not looking at the default data, which shows that default is nothing like the ratings which are being given. If we could get that right, the cost of capital right, then mitigation would become much cheaper and would need much less subsidy, because the technologies are now certainly in power generation and others. And then we could look at the concessional finance and the long-term lending for adaptive development. Adaptation is not a thing in itself. I mean, there are a few projects which are kind of only adaptation. They serve no other purpose, but most adaptation is just development investment in a climate change world. And we need longer term tenors of lending, because the purpose of adaptation spending is to make growth more sustainable. It isn't just to protect this bit of infrastructure from the next hurricane. It's to change the growth conditions, and that needs longer term lending, and that will repay itself over time. So I think there's a fundamental kind of we haven't grasped intellectually what this climate crisis is about fully yet, and I think there's a lot can be done there. Just on the quantum of money, we have a UNFCCC system which says that the people who should pay for climate finance in developing countries are the big polluters. Polluter pays, important principle. The other principle that we use in public finances is those who can afford it pay. And there are some countries that can afford it, are now rich, per capita rich, also happen to be major polluters, although that's more through production than consumption, and are not paying their fair share, which are the Gulf states and the other oil states, of which Norway is one, although Norway's rate of spending is quite high. And I do think we need to find the money, not now on the basis of the politics of 1992, but on the distribution of income in the world now. Why are the oil states rich? They're rich because we've given them the money. When I say we, I mean the middle classes and the lower middle classes of every country in the world. The money they have received over the last few years through the high oil price comes from consumers. It's consumers who paid the money, and it's gone to a relatively small number of countries, a relatively small number of companies. In the West, we're now taxing those companies quite highly, but there are a lot of state-owned enterprises. So I do think we need to look at where the money actually is and ask the people who can afford to pay to contribute a bit more.
Thanks, Michael. I think you've set us up there nicely. You've identified a bunch of knowledge gaps as far as I can see. Finance ministers don't know enough about climate modeling, not as good as it could be yet. And then like quite a lot of advocacy points as well around cost of capital and you know, where the money is coming from, where it is going. Rattan is chomping at the bit to get in, but I am not going to let him. I am going to open it up to the audience now. Questions, if you like, for the panelists. There's also going to be, I think, a survey behind me that you can fill in on another Mentimeter. But I'm also keen to get people's comments on, you know, what are the knowledge gaps that an organization like ODI should be trying to fill on an agenda like this, or the advocacy that they should be pushing. Try to limit it to one thing. What's your biggest priority? Okay, there's definitely a hand there and there. So we're off to a good start.
Hi, it's Mark Boland from RED. My question is for Joseph, and it's on subnational governments raising revenue. So the share of GDP of the government revenue going to county governments, I think, has stagnated over the past decade. I think it's in connection with government revenue as a percentage of GDP also being more or less stagnant. And I know there were plans presented by the Treasury for these subnational governments to raise raise more revenue internally. I don't think a lot has happened, or what I've seen. I'm not particularly well informed, so maybe you could just talk a little bit about what these efforts have been and what have been the difficulties and what have been the successes, and how that can kind of increase the resilience, economic resilience of Kenya as a whole. Thank you.
Yeah, we have another question here, and Yamini as well in the middle.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for a very candid panel. Rattan, what you said would have been provocative 5 years ago, but right now it's the God honest truth. So thank you. This room is primarily made up of, I think, folks in national treasuries and development workers and researchers doing practical applied work. If you were to, and you can't say everything, if you were to identify priorities for development workers, for development thinkers and the IFIs, top 3 priorities, what would those be? I think 2 mega trends that came from Joseph, but relate to revenue bases shrinking, and the digitization of the economy, which is a lot more difficult to tax despite some very noble efforts going along. So I think we're in a secular stagnation, and I think that trend is going to continue. Larry Summers has been talking about this for 15 years. It's certainly a trend and not cycle. And a difficult question, but what would you suggest? Top 3 priorities. Thank you.
Continuing in the vein of it's trend, not cycle, are we talking to the wrong people? in the sense that I think one of the most powerful statements of the last 2 days came from the session on cities when we were talking about vision and taxation and the politics of vision and taxation, which was essentially summarized as needing to reframe the social contract. This is not something that finance ministries can do, but finance ministries so any talk about how do we think about fiscal policy, monetary policy, taxation, everything else that comes in together, on the top of all of this is the social contract, which has been broken. We need to reimagine it. But we are in a room of practical people. And so the question is, can we be talking to finance ministries and treasuries and central bankers without talking to the I don't know what the right word is, but the equivalent of the planners? There has to be something sitting up there that is shaping some version of this vision and growth strategy, given everything else, into which the conversation of finances has to come in. So just something to hear your reflections on.
Excellent. Joseph, let's start with you because there's specific question for you on subnational revenue mobilization. And actually, we got a similar question from Paddy Sianga online. Same question. What role should subnational domestic revenue mobilization play in an economic resilience agenda? I'll then let the other panelists pick up the questions they feel they want to take on. That will probably take us to closing remarks because, so please do offer your own view on what you think the public finance team at ODI might focus on, but also more broadly, because I think this week has shown that ODI is a big tent and we're working quite well together, much better than in any of the last 10 years that I've worked here.
Thank you. I want to take the question of the subnational or the county government, with that we call it county government. According to our constitution, they're supposed to get 15% of the last year audited revenue. But what we are being given them is more than 15%. And what has been the issue is that they have been increasing gradually, but not in that big margin. But the issue is that we have not devolved all the function which they're supposed to take as per the constitution. So if we are going to devolve more function to them to undertake, maybe that one can trigger an increase in the revenue, shareable revenue. It's something which should follow the increase in function being transferred to the devolved government, and then now you transfer more money to the county. But the constitution normally states not less than 15%, but we have been giving more than that. But they continue demanding more and more. But what has created a scenario where when the government transfer the national government transfer the money, it has made them not to raise their own revenue. So you find that their own source of revenue, they have declined in terms of collecting. So it is something which they have to raise their own source of revenue as we transfer money to the county so that they are able not to, because they are created dependent system where you give them money, they don't collect for their own source. But something which can be considered as we progress, they raise their own revenue, we collect more, and transfer the function to them so that they're able to do it. In DFI, what they can do is that this is an issue which we continue receive and we want it to continue, where we continue building capacity in terms of analyzing, in terms of be able to sensitizing the people so that they're able to, and the costing, which has been said that we need to understand the costing so that we are able to budget for aligned to that one. The other issue which you have mentioned is about the DFI must come in to help us analyze and building capacity, which should be continuous, because people continue retiring. Maybe it can be programmed that there is every quarter or every year that creating on modeling and address the issues. A part which has mentioned, maybe that's the last one, that the Minister of Finance maybe don't have capacity to understand the climate finance. I agree with that because we have ministers responsible for environment. They need to work together, Minister of Finance and Minister of Environment, and other key partners in understanding what are these issues of credit finance so that we are able to get clarity and finance them. Something.
Thank you, Joseph. Let me go to Kay next, and then Michael back to, I'll give Ratan the final word considering he is my former managing director.
Okay, I think the critical point is that what we need is institutional strengthening, and it's really important as to how public finances are managed and how we address resilience for the future. So the needing to unpack problems together and the needing to have different perspectives on them. It's not just a luxury or and something else to do or a different way to do it. It's really, really important in order for institutions to continue learning about what they are and how they are developing. Because in this world of change, the treasuries themselves, those line ministries themselves, the context, everything is changing. And the only way in which to ensure that that can be managed is for us to really understand the context as best we can and have different perspectives on it. And I think I'd really like to lift up not only opening up the lines of communication within government. I think one of the areas that ODI could work on is to look at the linear lines of authority within government in terms of, you know, departments and where your official authority or mandate is, or which sphere of government which is independent, for example. And then how does that, how does that relate to a lot of these big problems for public finance that are cross-cutting? Who's going to sign on the dotted line? Who should lead? I think is even a question that each government, probably each country also needs to decide for themselves. And certainly, never mind who should lead, everybody should be on board. The problems we face are huge. So I think looking at the structure or the institutional designs and how that helps us address problems is really, really important. The other thing is how we communicate. And I think we had Manja, I'm going to quote her again, when she was saying she really knows they know how to market themselves well. And I think communication is a skill for PF that is way underrated. And certainly when I started working in public finance, it wasn't what I was hired for. It was for the hard technical skills. And then I think lastly, to come back to Ratan's point about countries will focus inwardly, we really have to make a good effort also to see how we will cooperate when, as countries, we do have similar problems, and to the extent that we could actually leverage and assist each other in doing that.
Thank you, Kay. Okay, Michael.
I want to take the question about kind of what brings it all together at higher level, but to do that on the international sphere, which is the one I know better. And I think this is a really open question now. We've had a climate governance model at international level focused on the UN, under the UN, in the UNFCCC, which has actually served us much better than most people think. The COPs are unbelievably frustrating things, but not the first COP I was involved in, the first kind of major COP I was involved in, Copenhagen in 2009, the assessment of the IPCC as we went into that conference was that the world was heading towards 5 to 7 degrees of warming. By the time we got to Paris in 2015, it was 2 to 4 degrees of warming. Why? Because actually, despite everybody thinking Copenhagen was a failure, countries took commitments, particularly China, but all countries took commitments and started reducing their emissions growth path, or in developed countries' case, their absolute emissions. We're now, as we go into COP30, looking at 2 to 3 degrees of warming. Now, when the NDCs are all added up, the nationally determined contributions, and they come out at 2.5, 2.6, 2.7, we will say that's a failure. And it is, because they're meant to be at 1.5 to 2. That was the international commitment. But this is huge progress over this period between 2009 and 2025. And it is because of a combination. The technology, the massive reduction in technology costs is the primary reason. But why has there been a massive reduction in technology costs? Because there was policy to promote the technologies. And that led to a virtuous policy innovation circle in which, as we put in targets for renewable energy, companies innovated in those things. They improved the performance, they improved the cost. That allowed scale. China then got into the, as the scale came in, the prices went down. That allowed targets to be improved. So this is a good story. But it was a story of how we built the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement now has very little else to negotiate. So we'll get to COP30 and there's almost nothing to negotiate. The formal conference will have very little to negotiate. There are a few things. And we are now in implementation, and implementation is primarily an economic problem. It's not a target setting problem, although that may be part of it. And we need to really integrate climate into our understanding of development and growth, developed countries and developing countries alike. And I think we need new institutions to do that. And the reason I asked Ivan, when I said about getting real, I meant I was trying to get him to be a bit more honest about their processes, not that they're not dealing with the real world. Because Brazil has tried two different things. The TF Clima was a ministries of finance and climate together. The Circle of Finance Ministers is just finance ministries. And when you read the Circle of Finance Ministers paper, which will be out next week, you will see, and those of you with experience of these things will realize what's happened, that they've made no commitments to anything. And I can tell you what's happened, which is that the finance ministries operating on their own, because they haven't got their climate ministries with them, have redlined nearly everything. In principle, we're all committed to 1.3 trillion flowing by 2035, but what finance ministries will do is look at each of the methods by which you can reach that number and say no. And they will say, no, we don't think SDRs, for example. Literally, a major European government finance ministry said to me when I said we should be looking at another issuance of SDR. No, SDRs are just for emergencies. Well, the climate emergency, government, is an emergency. And so no to SDRs. Should we be doing new levies, new solidarity levies on shipping, or no, we don't agree with that one. And if you rule out all the methods by which we might be able to reach 1.3 trillion, you are not committed to 1.3 trillion. And that's the position of the major finance ministries in every major economy, not just the Western ones, because they're not fully committed to this and so on. So I think we need the TF Clima model, which is we need to stick the climate ministries with the finance ministries, and then they can have some proper arguments about what their government priorities are as a whole. Often internally in the same country, and I think that will, and so what I don't exactly know how this could work, because we also need the private sector. The private sector is, but President Lula has proposed a new climate council, which is some kind of more executive body. If it's more streamlined, if it's focused on implementation, it's a more realistic understanding of the economy and climate together. If it involves climate ministries as well as finance ministries and the private sector, in my view, then we have a greater chance of providing that high-level kind of guidance that we don't really have at the moment. And I think we need an evolution of the international system for that reason.
Thanks, Michael. Ratan, I'm guessing that you want to talk about, take Yamini's question at the national level.
Also, sort of second what you said, I think you're absolutely right. Climate is not a priority for finance ministries. Let's be straight about it. And if it's not, then I think a lot of the work that happens on the international stage should be about, and for ODI, since you asked, should be about making a business case for finance ministries to be interested, at least if it's not a priority, on climate issues. And in India, I constantly make the case, I'm a trustee of climate bonds, and I'm very involved in the green bond issuance business now, that actually in a country like India, which has third-class productivity, antiquarian systems, everything we do on climate actually improves productivity. So I've given them a reality check, which is any climate proposal that comes, does it increase productivity or not? If it does, adopt it. So that's something that's India friendly, you see? And you're right, I mean, no finance ministry in the world is going to worry about climate when all the problems you mentioned are on your heads. Climate is somewhere else. I have a clear and present risk now. So coming to clear and present risk, I'm very grateful that one message I seem to have dropped from the questions. Cycle is over. Don't do cycle analysis in the finance ministry ever again, starting tomorrow. Counter-cyclical is over. And if the fund tells you, don't listen to them. Actually, they're not. It takes a long time. It's a bureaucracy to seep down from the leaders down to the operational guys will take time. But I assure you, I don't think in 3 or 4 years, you're going to be sort of hearing much about DSG modeling, for example. Sorry, I have to be technical because you asked what finance ministries do. Okay, that's all over. Today, we have parametric analysis that's of the essence. So the more of that you can bring into the finance ministry in terms of analytical equipment, the better will be what will be demanded of you from the political authorities, I think, more and more. Our room to make mistakes is receding because of the geopolitical environment. So how do you get your predictability strike rate up? That is going to be a major, major question that is going to confront all permanent secretaries, all chief economic advisors across the world. Treasury was pretty good at it, but I wish he was here, the OBR guy, who I have a lot of time and respect for. He's one of the best in the business. OBR has got things horribly wrong in the last 5 years. Their credibility is down. So yeah, there you go. There you are. There you are. Great, you're here. Remember our long conversation was last ODI and how predictable you are and how accurate you are. Now look, I mean, as he's saying, the world's gone bananas. So we have to get our predictability right, which means we have to get our.
I just want to clarify.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify one thing. When
What?
you said no more counter-cyclical policy, are you suggesting that like governments shouldn't set aside funds during good times?
No, you should set aside funds for bad things to happen.
Okay, that's the
And
same.
you should plan all the time for bad things to happen. That's the meaning of a cycle, because good things are not going to happen tomorrow. The assumption is I spend more when things are bad because things are good are going to happen. I'm saying the trend now is bad things are going to happen and keep happening. So you're going to have to spend on stopping those bad things from happening and ameliorating the problems that bad things bring to the people, chiefly the prosperity of Generation Z, which is under threat. So public finance has to reorient its political economy definitions of what it is supposed to be doing, whether on the tax front or on the expenditure front. Therefore, I mean, that was my penultimate point, actually. On expenditure management, I think you would have to come up or actually help some of the good thinking that's going on, I think, in the multilaterals and others, on what expenditure management is for. Because in a world where, parameters are, everything is non-parametric, the idea that public expenditure management is some kind of accountability PIFA plus exercise, I think we have to leave that behind. That's easy. It's not fun, particularly. It's rather boring, in my opinion. But I don't think that that bread and butter business is going to exist anymore. Countries will demand more. Countries will want to know how I can manage my public finances, not just prudently, but more effectively, because there's going to be less money, and I have to spend it better, and I have to predict it better, right? The strike rate has to go up. So we will need to sort of remodel the way we have been doing public expenditure management, analysis, principles, etc., going forward. Final point, I think we will all have to pay, because I'm saying the world will go internal. I think finance ministries will have to recognize two things. Any finance ministry, whether you have a planning ministry or not, will have to pay far more attention to current account management, currency management, exchange rate management, because you're going to have capital controls everywhere, whether you like it or not, and what that will do in terms of its impact both on the economy and on budgets and fiscal policy more generally. That is one. Second, I'm afraid the elephant in the room, which aid and all the things that we are good at doing in the international community, will have to take second place now to asking the hard question: who is saving how much, and what proportion of that saving, you raised this point, is available to government to do the things you want to do? Because in a world where you see Generation Z is badly affected, it means that your median saving coming from the people who are in the workforce is going to be much lower than the median saving coming from current asset holders, who are largely older people and more prosperous people. So if their legacy shifts down, that's fine. But by definition, in developing countries, that's a minority. Most people are poor, and their children are therefore going to be poor, and there's no legacy to gain. So the question of savings and where you're going to mobilize them and where you're going to deploy them and how you're going to value them becomes very important. And on climate, I agree with everything that he said. And I think that is really the focus that should be there for the international community. So to conclude, no more countercyclical, no more cycles. It's all going to be trend and parametric analysis. No more saying I'm the finance ministry, I do fiscal policy, because that will not happen without looking at international, balance of payments issues, currency issues, and capital controls. And you can see that the IMF has changed their DSA to incorporate these features, which is very good, right? And expenditure management has to be more about results. I think that's what people mean by outcome-based. I don't know. Finance ministries don't do outcomes, right? They make sure the money is spent where it was supposed to go. But the money was spent effectively, we have not looked at. We'll have to have that sort of, results framing. And, and finally, don't worry too much about climate in the finance ministry. Outsource that to international negotiations. There are politicians in every country who love climate. Let the environment ministry do the job. And maybe in ODI, what you can do is support finance ministries to absorb that information and make sure that they're not overburdened by the nitty-gritty of climate management. Because we all don't have Ivan Oliveira.
Thank you, Ratan. The first thing I'm going to do is talk to you about counter-cyclical policy in a minute once this is
Right.
finished, because I'm not sure we're talking about the same thing. All right, I'm not going to labor the closing here. It's been a very long 2 days. What I do want to do is thank you all sincerely for coming and contributing. Gonzalo would like to come up and say a few words, but I think we'll draw the online version of this to an end, right? Okay. Thank you very much.